Prepare for low investment returns over the next 30 years. Yeah. So I'm going to share with you an article I was reading. It's very interesting, and I just got on my phone here. It's from The Atlantic. Maybe you guys can see that. Can't tell. Yeah, maybe not. Anyway, it says, the mystery as to why the Japanese are having so few babies. Many point to an unromantic 20-somethings and women's entering the workforce, but an overlooked factor is trouble for young men finding steady, well-paid jobs. All right, so hang in there. So I'm going to tie this all together and why I don't think that we're going to have great returns. In fact, I think it's going to be probably 4% net of inflation going forward. So let me share with you here real quick. But there's another simple explanation for the country's low birth rate. Japan's birth rate may be falling because there are fewer good opportunities for young people, especially men, in the country's economy. In a country where men are still widely expected to be breadwinners and support families, a lack of good jobs may be creating a class of men who don't marry and have children because they and their potential partners know they can't afford it. Shrinking economic opportunities stem from a larger trend that is global in nature, the rise of unsteady employment. Since the post-war years, Japan has had a tradition of regular employment, as labor experts commonly called it, in which men started their careers at jobs that gave them good benefits, dependable raises, and the understanding that if they worked hard, they could keep their jobs until retirement. Now, according to a professor over at Temple University's Japan campus, about 40% of the Japanese workforce is irregular, basically temps, meaning they don't work for companies where they have stable jobs for the whole career, and instead they piece together temporary and part-time jobs with low salaries and no benefits. Let's see. From 1995 to 2008, Japan's number of regular workers, people who have a salary assigned to a company, decreased by almost 4 million, while the number of temp workers increased by 7.6. You could look at temp as contractual people, just come in for a job, but you're not on our payroll, you're not on our benefits or anything like that. Isn't that interesting? All right, so the rise of the irregular workers in Japan began in the 90s when the government revised labor laws to enable the wider use of temporary and contract workers hired by intermediary firms. Then, as globalization put more pressure on companies to cut costs, ding, 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 they increasingly relied on temporary workforce, a trend that intensified during the Great Recession. Isn't that interesting? So basically what they're saying is men who used to have a good job at a good company, got good benefits and could continue on until they retired, those days are gone. Now it's all temporary and contractual work, 1099 essentially. Now nothing inherently wrong with that, but they don't get benefits and they're not getting that much in terms of increases in pay, if at all. Interesting. It's very, and I guess a lot of ladies like, look, in fact, I'll even check this out. And some lady at the Tokyo Institute of Technology says, Japan has this idea that the man is supposed to get a regular job. If you graduate and don't find a job as a regular employee, people look at you as a failure. Oh, and by the way, roughly 70% of Japanese women quit working after they have their first child and depend on their husband's salary for some time. Women in Japan's big cities says they're getting tired of the lack of available men. The men are the guys with regular jobs, not temporary jobs. So what does this have to do with expect lower rates of stock market returns? Well, it's pretty simple. The days of globalization are coming to a fast and furious end because what Japan was doing back then, globalization, lower labor costs. We're not having big labor company. We're going to have contractual basis, temporary work. Those days are over, man. So let me show you something here. What I was doing here is I took 4 different time frames of the S&P 500. 1871, which is kind of like the beginning of the markets, if you will, after the Civil War. to 1900, and that's going to be a deflationary time frame. But the actual markets, net of inflation, did well because there was deflation. So the markets averaged 8.2% a year. Now remember, this is a huge post-Civil War boom, the Industrial Age. This is when railroads were going rampant. It was corrupt as could be, I grant you. But if you held stocks, you did fine. It's just as long as you held them and kept the dividends and kept reinvesting and buying more shares. In fact, here's an article. Check this out. Calvin Page left a $6.5 million estate in 1909. That's in those years. He was a San Francisco merchant from Massachusetts who went to, as a young man, he went to California as a 49er. And basically, there's a lot of odd stuff in this, and I've done some research on it, and maybe one day I'll write a book on it or something that's interesting to me as I'll get out. But just some dude from Massachusetts went to California, and he died. He's not widow, never married, never had kids. He died rich and alone. But it left us $6.5 million in 1909 dollars in his estate. It's crazy, just by investing in stocks. That's all he did. Yeah, interesting. Anyway, so the point being was, if you invest in stocks back then, you could get wealthy, even though there was deflation, because of the country was growing, the westward expansion, the railroads, the industrialization, changing farming techniques to steam engines and later gasoline engines. I mean, it's so much more productive. All right, then we go into the next 50-year time frame. Obviously, that wasn't 50 years here, but you get it. 1900 to 1950. Net of inflation, we have averaged 5.38. Now, that was still an era of vast industrialization, electrification, indoor plumbing. But even in the 1950s, a lot of people still didn't have all that. But either way, however, that was also the panic in the 1900s, the early 1900s. We also had the Federal Reserve Board that came out with 1913. We had the Great Wars of World War I and World War II, which kind of solidified the globalists to take over. That's a fact. The Great Depression. Yeah, but we still had telephone expansion, refrigeration expansion, so we're still expanding, westward expansion. I mean, it wasn't that long later where the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants moved to California. So we still have this mass expansion westward. We're still growing. A military-industrial complex kicked in, but still, even with all that stuff said, it was still a growth. We're still moving from a emerging market to the basic top of the game at the end of that era of the 1950s. So even with all that stuff going on, we still squeaked out a 5.38% rate of return net of inflation, which include the Great Depression and two insane wars and the advent of the Federal Reserve Board. And we didn't do it with debt either, by the way. Just pointing that out. That didn't happen until later. Then you got the globalization that we're just talking about with the Japanese people. And in the globalization times, we averaged 9.04% a year. And that was simple because globalization, we brought Japan in, the export economies, South Korea, China came in. Isn't it interesting? From the 1980s when China really began to ramp up, all of a sudden we could have not just cheap labor, but literally slave labor that we could use to make our products for low cost. Send companies overseas, cheap labor overseas, slave labor overseas, cheap exports to the United States. So we'd import it, they'd export because their dollars are so much worth less in the United States. Cheap imports for us would be exports for them, but cheap imports for us. And all that meant there's more money to spend on other things, increasing technology. Still pretty cheap energy, but not quite as cheap as it was earlier in the 1900s and 1950s, but still relatively cheap. Still using oil. Natural gas, we did run some issues in the late 70s, 100%, but then we started to get that we got rid of price controls, essentially, and that changed that. But isn't it interesting? Huge increases in debt. So we had huge increases in globalization on top of huge increases of debt, and we averaged 9.04% a year. Now, here we are today. We've only averaged 3.91% a year in this time right here, in the last 22 years. And this is the S&P 500 net of inflation. By far the worst we've done in the other three scenarios. Now again, every scenario is longer, a 30 years and two 50-year scenario. Right now we're in year 23. However, globalization is no longer. You can't just go to India and cheap labor. I mean, you can get cheaper than you can in the United States, I grant you, but the days of cheap labor are dead. The days of freaking debt financing of you can just spend with debt. That's all. Look what's happening in Japan right now. That debt is being come home to roost because they have no energy independence. It's crazy. You can't just finance stuff with cheap debt. I mean, you can, I grant you, but not to the extent you could in the previous 50 years with cheap labor, cheap money, all that stuff. These days are gone, man. So the problem that we have to confront with is like, well, if the debt has been used, the energy costs are going to be way through the roof. On top of that, you don't have a bunch of new kids coming up to take the jobs of the older. I mean, they're not going to come in at a cheaper wage, even internally in the United States. I talked to a guy today. He's an older senior guy, so you got to let him go and give him a nice 2-year severance. And he's like, basically, I had to work as like an apprentice for a year before they let me in the door, essentially, to get on full time. Now they just pull anyone off the street you can fog a mirror. That's not good in terms of productivity. Productivity is going down. Labor costs still aren't low. You can't go to India anymore. The cheap labor. I mean, again, it's cheaper than here, but it still costs money to ship. Energy is more expensive. The days of high investment returns are over. There's going to be 3.9 net of inflation for the S&P 500. That's pretty much what I'm using, about 4% net of inflation for the S&P 500. I'd highly suggest you do the same. The only way you have increasing stocks above that are earnings growth. Earnings growth. Where's the earnings come from? Cheap labor? No. Cheap energy? No. I mean, not happening, man. Other than export, we import stuff. The exports that we take other countries' exports in here, but yeah, is that really good for American companies? No, actually, it hurts American companies who are trying to send their own goods overseas because of strong dollar. It can be hard to see where the earnings growth year over year increases relative to the cost. Labor costs still high, regulations way high. Anyway, just use that in your planning. I think it'd be wise if you do it. Love your thoughts. We'll see you.